Things would have gone differently, they say, with another commanding officer. The story of the HMS Hermione would have been a different one, and with it, American history. That, at least, is the thesis of Roger Eckert's excellent book, American Sanctuary, which came out last year. It's a great book. Eckert tells the story of how our presidential election in 1800 was shaped by an issue we have totally forgotten about. A controversy over the fallout of what happened to alleged American citizens impressed into naval service aboard an infamous British ship, the HMS Hermione. Things could have gone well on that ship, with a different captain at the helm. A captain the crew had reason to trust. Instead, the ship had recently received a new captain, Hugh Piggott, a late admiral's 28-year-old son, became the captain of the ship. He was very gifted as a tactician, and that was about where his leadership qualities ended. Piggott's command experience was but 3 years deep. He was unfamiliar to much of the crew serving under him. And on his last command, he had ordered 85 vicious floggings of his sailors in just 9 months. 2 members of his old crew had died from their whippings. Once installed on his new ship, he played favorites between the crew members who came with him and the ones that were already there. His mood and his behavior were erratic. He was sensitive to the slightest slight, and he demanded his officers literally bow before him. During a perilous storm, Captain Piggott shouted threats to the topmen working on the mast, telling them that the last one down would be beaten severely. In their terror and their haste, 3 of them plunged to their deaths. Captain Piggott ordered their corpses shamefully swept off the deck into the sea. The next rainy morning, he had 14 of his men beaten. No wonder the night to come, September 21st, 1797, would be the last night alive for Captain Piggott and several other officers on board the HMS Hermione. It was mutiny that night, and so turned the wheels of history. Last Sunday, as we picked up Paul's letter to Titus as delegate to the rough and tumble new churches of the infamously post-truth mission field in Crete, we described his ministry as being like sailing a ship or a fleet of ships through choppy seas, like the dangerous waters off the southern Cretan coastline. We talked last Sunday about the importance for a ship to have a shore anchor to give a ship stability in the times of storm. For us, for the church, our shore anchor is a God who never lies. And that was a great relief for Titus, surrounded as he was by a culture that generally didn't care about truth and was skeptical of even the possibility of knowledge. Titus needed a sure anchor, and Paul promised that he had it. But just like a ship needs a shore anchor, a ship also needs trustworthy officers. The team responsible for steering the ship and giving leadership to the rest of the crew. If a ship's officers act like Captain Piggott of the HMS Hermione, the ship is going to be in real trouble. And in fact, the HMS Hermione did not accomplish what it set out to do because the mission was compromised by that understandable, if brutal, mutiny. Just like a ship, a local church needs trustworthy officers. The local church needs a captain and other officers who can steer it with confidence and wisdom, who can give leadership to the rest of the crew, who can ably get the ship where it needs to go, and ensure that morale stays high, the crew stays fed, resources stay managed well, and so on. It will not do to have Captain Pickett as the pastor, the lay delegate, the trustee, the class leader, the steward. That will not do. Some of us have been in such situations. But this is basically what Paul tells Titus in this morning's passage. He reminds Titus that Titus's job is to select officers for each ship in the fleet of Cretan churches. These officers are variously called elders and overseers, and they need to meet certain qualifications if they're going to guide their ships. Now, if you compare Titus to the other letters, Paul doesn't raise the bar too high for church leadership in Crete. It's a very rough culture, and all the believers there are new believers, not like the folks Timothy's working with in Ephesus. So, how much can you ask of a new believer stepping into a church leadership role? But Paul still insists that if the ship isn't going to crash, and if there aren't going to be grounds for mutiny, the ship's officers will need some basic qualifications. And the same is true for the people leading this church. Your pastor, but also your lay delegate, your trustees, your stewards, all the officers of the board. So what does Paul insist that we officers of the churchly ship need to be? Well, the officers of the ship need to be above reproach. We need to have no charge that can fairly be laid against us, nothing to compromise our broader reputation. Paul fleshes that out. He envisions the officer as a one-woman man with believing children. Now, is that a command for that the elder has to be married and has to have children? No, that was just something Paul could assume they already would have. In Crete, that would just be the most common thing. Paul himself had neither wife nor children. But Paul is envisioning that his church leaders who are married will be faithful in marriage and wise leaders for any families they do have. They will raise their children to love the Lord rather than tolerating all sorts of nonsense. Next, Paul focuses on what we have to not be. The officers of the ship cannot afford to be arrogant, pointing to themselves and insisting that others in the church bow before them and their personal agendas. That is not allowed. The officers of the ship cannot be quick-tempered, ready to fly off the handle and behave erratically. In short, Paul is saying, Captain Pickett is disqualified right here and right now. The officers of the ship are not allowed to be self-willed, not allowed to be prone to outbursts of anger, not allowed to be violent types of people, nor can the officers afford to be addicts. The word Paul uses to suggest addiction to wine. Wine is popular in Crete, probably because the wine is very good in Crete. Local church leaders, at the very minimum, have to be free from such addictions and habits and tempers. Unlike the many false teachers who are mainly concerned with profit margins, church leaders cannot afford to be greedy, always looking for their fee or a way to turn their position, their financial advantage. You know the stories. Now, Paul believes strongly in the right of full-time Christian workers to get their living by the gospel. Paul even says in his letters that those elders who preach and teach are worthy of double honor, and that probably suggests a high standard of compensation compared to others. But they are not allowed to be focused on gain beyond that level. They certainly are not to be out collecting fees for every little thing. That is what the officers may not be. Instead, officers in the church need to be hospitable. The word used there, they literally need to love strangers, love guests, love interruptions. In Titus's world, the leaders in the churches need to be ready to offer food and accommodation to traveling missionaries like Paul who would come in and visit. They would also need to open their homes to other believers in general for meetings there. In today's context, you might say that each church officer should be ready to host a Bible study, a prayer group, a house church gathering, a festivity where believers mingle with unbelievers. In a setting like Crete, where do you think people would be most likely to hear the gospel for the very first time? Where would people be when that happened? Probably seated at the table in the home of a Christian host, like one of the church leaders there. In today's world, with people mistrustful of the so-called institutional church, and everybody professing to treasure their sleep so much more on a Sunday morning than every other day of the week, we might be in just the same place. Dinner invitations, small gatherings with Christian and non-Christian friends together, just sharing life with each other. That might be the place where the gospel can spread and flourish best. And Paul's saying officers in the church need, at the bare minimum, to set the stage for exactly those kinds of gospel encounters and gospel fellowships. That's hospitality. Paul adds other virtues too: self-control, upright, holy, disciplined. On board a ship sailing at sea, those are the kinds of people you want at the helm. You don't want the guy at the wheel to panic easily or break under pressure. You don't want the officers to be drinking and partying when they need to be focused on a safe and well-directed voyage. You don't want them to be corrupt. You don't want them to play favorites. You don't want them to be good targets for a bribe or to default on the crew's trust. You want them, ideally, to be self-controlled, upright, holy, disciplined. The same is true for your church board. You want your leaders here at Pequea to be self-controlled, upright, holy, disciplined. And finally, officers in the church need to be committed to the trustworthy word as taught. In other words, they need to be loyal to the gospel message and the elements of Christian teaching. The officers of your church are not allowed to be cult leaders who make it up as they go along. They can't be inventing new heresies or reviving old ones. They can't be indulging their pet theological agendas. They need to be whole gospel people. They need to be committed to the truth. And they need to understand it well enough to tell the difference between the gospel and its many counterfeits. Why do they need to do that? For what purpose? Well, they need to give instruction in healthy teaching. God willing, that's what I do up here on a Sunday, give you instruction in the healthy teaching of the prophets and apostles to fill your lives with more health, more life. Now that can't stop on a Sunday, and it's not just my job alone. Paul says a church leader needs not only to be able to instruct the willing, but also to rebuke those who contradict it. In other words, a church leader, a church officer, has to offer clear-headed answers to those who start filling the air, or just their own heads, with crazy ideas that don't lead to health. That's a picture that Paul gives of what the church leaders, the church officers need to be at minimum. Above reproach, faithful and wise in family life, not arrogant, not quick-tempered, not addicted, not violent, not greedy. Instead, loving what's good, keeping self-control, being upright, holy, and disciplined, welcoming the church into their homes, and providing places where believers can be the light of Christ to non-Christian friends who are made to feel welcome too. Being loyal to the Christian message, understanding the Bible well enough to offer healthy teaching to others and to correct those who are making a mess of it. That is what Paul asks Titus to use as a standard in selecting church leaders, officers aboard the ships in his fleet. And we have a right to expect the same here. This morning, as we hold our congregational meeting, you'll hear from several of the officers of this crew. You'll have the opportunity to, as a congregation, appoint some officers. Yes, there are specific job descriptions we have in our church bylaws for exactly what a trustee does, what a steward does, what a class leader does, and all the rest. But beneath all those specific job descriptions, there's what Paul is telling Titus about the character description. Who a trustee, a steward, a lay delegate, a class leader, a pastor is supposed to be. As we commit to another year of sailing this ship, keep these things in mind. There need be no mutinies, because every member has a hand here in choosing and confirming leaders who fit this vision. And every member and friend has a hand here in encouraging the officers of this church in living this vision. May this ship be steered well, and may her crew benefit from good and health-giving leadership. In Jesus' name, amen.